Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Scrubbing the Skies, the webinar series of the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal. As always, I'm your host, Wil Burns. I serve as co-director of the Institute. The Institute is a think tank at American University that focuses on social science aspects of carbon removal, including issues of governance, ethics, and public engagement. And I'm glad, as always, that many of you have come to join us for what I think will be a very interesting episode. So while the CDR information site, CDR FYI, released a quarterly report last week, which indicated that carbon removal deliveries and purchases have increased substantially over last year. It also emphasized that the amount remains incredibly small, especially in comparison to the very large amounts of carbon removal that we'll need to effectuate starting in the 2030s, the 2040s, and beyond. And as always, this has revived the question of whether there needs to be a role for carbon removal in compliance markets to create the requisite demand so that carbon removal can be an effective complement to traditional mitigation moving forward. And to date, most of that discussion has been in the halls of academia or in NGOs. However, there's a new bill in California that would transform all of this, potentially creating legal mandates for carbon removal in the sixth largest economy in the world. And I'm very pleased to have somebody who's closely tracking that legislation to join me today to discuss the provisions of that bill and their potential. So I'm joined by Sam Uden, who serves as Director of Climate and Energy Policy at Conservation Strategy Group, LLC. And Sam, welcome.
Thank you, Will. Good to be here.
Thanks. And what we're going to do is a little different than our usual format. We're going to have a chat, Sam and I, at the outset to talk about this bill, and then in the latter part of the webinar, we'll do what we always do, which is open it up to audience questions. So I encourage everyone to start populating the chat box, and I'll try to look there and see how many questions we have to determine how much time we should carve out at the end for those questions. So with that, let us just get into it. So first of all, Sam, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and what the Conservation Strategy Group does?
Sure. So conservation, I'll start with the business. So we're an environmental lobbying firm based in Sacramento. So we do state level energy and environmental policy work. We primarily represent environmental nonprofits. On different, like we just sort of do conservation, land protection, water, and climate and energy issues. But in recent years, we've also kind of grown our climate policy work to have sort of a separate kind of think tank climate kind of policy research and advocacy function, which is primarily supported by climate philanthropy. So I am in charge of that small team, and then also assist on some of the lobbying as it relates to climate and energy policy. So one of the kind of priorities this year is to engage on SB 308. So
okay, so nice segue to SB 308. So my understanding is SB 308 seeks to be one of the means of operationalizing California's Global Warming Solutions Act of 2008, California's legislation. So I was wondering, to scaffold this, could you start off by briefly explaining what the key objectives are of the Global Warming Solutions Act, and then we'll move to 308.
okay. So going right back. So AB 32 is sometimes what the kind of it's referred to as kind of California's foundational climate law. which did a number of things and has kind of been built on and expanded over time. But this is going back to 2006. The main thing it did was it authorized the State Air Resources Board, who at that point had been kind of our air pollution agency, it endowed it with the authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. So it's quite a broad authority to come up with new policies and programs as an independent agency to regulate and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And then the bill kind of established other kind of key pillars that you can imagine you'd need in a climate program. So it was, here's how we're going to do the inventory for the state to kind of track emissions. It established the original target, which was to reduce statewide emissions down to 1990 levels by 2020. Since then, in subsequent bills and in the same code section, we've added a 2030 target, which is 40% below, and then also a 2045 target, which is our net zero target. So it's that kind of core area of the Public Resources Code where we kind of have our kind of climate and greenhouse gas emissions rules and provisions.
All right, thanks for that. Before we move to the next question, just a clarification, I meant questions should go into the Q&A box, not the chat box. Sorry about that. All right, can you now outline some of the key provisions of the potential legislation, and then we'll get into some specifics.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So there are 5 key elements, I would say, to SB 308, and I'll just take them each in turn. So the first main element is that the bill would require this California Air Resources Board, the independent agency in California, to adopt regulations to achieve the state's carbon removal targets. So a bit of background there. When we passed our net zero mandate bill in Bill AB 1279, if anyone's interested to look it up, in 2022, it's a requirement that the state achieve net zero emissions by 2045, including 85% emissions reductions by 2045. So the implicit part of that is that the 15, so it's kind of you may in the more academic kind of arguments around mitigation, deterrence, and moral hazard. I mean, that's kind of a really nice legal mandate, which sort of really puts like a floor, that emissions reductions is kind of the pillar, and net zero includes this, like a significant amount of emissions reductions. It's sort of a tangent, but the remaining 15% is implicit CDR, which would be 65 million tons a year in California by 2045. So we need to build to that. And so this kind of first element is it requires the Air Board to develop regulations for the purpose of achieving that. So that's kind of the broad mandate that's been given, would be given to them. The next key element of the bill, which is really like a core piece of it, is that it would establish an interim target. So not just achieve the 2045, but an interim 2030 target to be, it's about 2 to 3 million tons of removals by that point. So it's an equivalent of 1% of the state's anticipated 2030 emissions. So that is kind of in speaking with some of the kind of industry folks like involved in the bill, it's like a really important piece kind of for these kind of startup kind of DAC and other companies that really need these kind of market signals to kind of help these technologies get going and then kind of start that journey down the cost curve. So that's like a kind of it being kind of a market development type bill is like a kind of a core theme. So there's so the Air Board gets the authority. There's the 2030 target. Then there are a series of guardrails to ensure high quality CDR. Without going through all of them, it's things like there's a clear specification that of the difference between reductions and removals to kind of remove any gray area around like offsets and things like that. That you can't use CO2. It wouldn't be eligible if it's used for enhanced oil recovery, the captured CO2. If there's going to be a biomass carbon removal strategy, the biomass must be a waste biomass. So they're the kinds of guardrails that are kind of contemplated in like a series of provisions. So that's 3. The 4th one is that it would expand the eligible sequestration methods beyond geologic storage. So there's a bit of background here, which is there was a bill passed in also 2022, SB 905. which was a kind of a sort of foundational kind of carbon capture and carbon removal bill, which at that point authorized the Air Board to develop the regulations to kind of support deployment of these technologies, not targets and things, just like kind of how are we going to do this? You know, what are the the kind of strategies to do it? What's acceptable? What's eligible? In that kind of foundational carbon capture, carbon removal bill, the sequestration is limited to it's all about geologic storage. But as we know, there's other ways to do kind of good removal. So this bill would seek to expand. It builds upon that the provisions in SB 905, but also seek to expand the eligible sequestration methods beyond just geologic storage. So you could do mineralization or something like that, you know. So that's the fourth. And then the last one is that there's a number of provisions to do with community engagement and kind of strategy. It's sort of building on, kind of where the DOE has really, shown a lot of leadership around community benefits plans and community benefit agreements. And so some requirements that developers do meetings and develop a plan and for community benefits and basically demonstrate a high level of community engagement. So yeah, 5 key sections, kind of authorizes the Air Board to develop, the broad authority to develop the regulations it needs to achieve the 2045 CDR target, sets an interim 2030 target, establishes a series of guardrails, waste biomass only and things like that, expands the eligible sequestration beyond just geologic storage, and then, has some community engagement elements. So.
Okay, so this looks a lot like what we often call a carbon take-back obligation, right? And that's often premised legally on the notion of polluter pays, right? But it's my understanding that's been a problematic aspect of this bill's history to date. Who's going to pay for this, right? But where does the bill currently stand in that context, and what implications does that have for it ultimately being effective?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a good point. So there was a previous, as a bit of background, a previous version of this bill last year kind of included a sort of explicit mechanism that would have required cap and trade covered entities and other California programs, that's kind of all our big emitters, to pay for the CDR that's would be in line with these targets. That received significant opposition. So what the bill currently is silent on the mechanism, but the implication is that the Air Resources Board, through its kind of regulatory process, will need to figure out kind of what kind of a mechanism could look like and kind of who pays. So I would say, I think it just seems, in the end, it's probably going to have to be polluters that pay, because if you think about the scale we need to get to, and you can't have governments around the world like footing, but in the near term, I think that's probably one of the options that they're considering. Or maybe there's no bill yet, but should it go through, I'm sure that'd be on the table. And then there's other programs that already exist, though, where there may be opportunities to leverage those as part of trying to foot the bill. So cap and trade is one, low carbon fuel standard is another, and they are polluter pay programs. So there's also revenues from polluter pay programs. So there's kind of I'd say there's kind of direct polluter pay, indirect polluter pay, some role for kind of public support, TBD. But right now that kind of explicit mechanism has been removed, and it's sort of something that will be determined through the regulatory process.
Okay. So you talked about there being different methods of sequestration. I think there's also been discussion about the issue of durability, which has implications for the technologies and processes that might count as carbon removal under a bill. What's the contemplated role for nature-based solutions, which are, usually recognized as less durable than the geological timescales we're talking about for carbon emissions in the atmosphere?
So the goal of the bill is to kind of create a big tent for carbon removal opportunities. So the idea is that there is no exclusion of potential options. But if you were to be a nature-based solution, is not my area of kind of like expertise, but basically if you could meet a really high standard and kind of requirements that kind of get close, with extensive potentially buffer pools and things like that, and theoretically you could manage your kind of asset, your nature-based asset for the period of time needed. You could be eligible, like you have the potential to be eligible to be kind of counted as a CDR under this, for the purpose of achieving the targets. What those nature-based, projects are, I'm not sure, like kind of what all the options are there, but the idea is that, nature-based and technological removals would all be kind of eligible, but you'd have to meet a high standard, which to geologic storage and others would meet that. And then if you're going to be a nature-based, it's kind of how can you demonstrate that you're going to meet like a high standard of durability, kind of, how that's kind of defined and determined is also something I would probably be worked out in a regulatory process.
Mm-hmm. So presumably they're thinking about things like horizontal and vertical stacking, right? And to ensure, because I'm not quite sure how they get to anything that's highly durable on at least geologic timescales with the nature based, and that's often one of the knocks on carbon takeback obligations.
Yeah. Is a stacking, is that like you stacking a series of nature-based projects or something? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, you can do it horizontally or vertically, right? Over time, or a large series of them at the same time to try to effectuate, 500, 1,000 years or more of sequestration, right? Or there's proposals that a company that took on an obligation could use nature-based in the shorter term with the proviso that when more durable sequestration was available, they would then purchase that to effectuate the goal.
I see. One of the, I'm sort of speculating, but another one could be, it's possible, because I'm just in the original original version where there was that kind of payer mechanism involved. This was actually another one of the issues. It was, and the mechanism, was proposing to do a two tracks of crediting. One is kind of less durable, and then one was kind of, and so it's another approach could be, it's again kind of everything. It could be two tracks maybe in the kind of as part of the regulatory process to sort of figure out that maybe nature based could be eligible, but it's discounted to some level on the basis that it is not kind of equivalently permanent as geologic. Like, I'm not, so there's basically a lot of, I mean, this is kind of why we have the regulatory process too. There's like a lot of ways you could potentially do it. My understanding of the intent though is the goal is that we don't want to exclude anything if they can meet the standard, and if we can figure out the creative way and a credible way to do it, then we should be open to that. So that's, the kind of that agnostic element is kind of another key part of the bill, because we don't, it's just it's a new thing, the tech and the nature, so we're trying not to kind of close doors too early, I think so.
Okay. So there's one provision of the bill, at least the version that I've seen, that would expressly exclude utilization of carbon dioxide for enhanced oil recovery, right? Which is obviously a controversial issue in a lot of places, including California. What's your personal opinion about that? Because on one hand, you have credible organizations like the Clean Air Task Force that argue that enhanced oil recovery can reduce carbon per ton of oil production by 60%, right? Because you're dealing with a fungible commodity that if you didn't use EOR and at least capture some CO2, you'd get your oil from somewhere else without EOR, and you'd get all the CO2 in the atmosphere, right? Yeah. And that EOR can help provide a viable initial revenue model for CDR that might help it stand it up and bring down costs, right? And obviously, there's plenty of folks that disagree with that.
Mhm.
I'm wondering if you have any insights into what was what was the thinking behind this? Was it mostly a political decision that the bill sponsors thought this was a third rail, or was there a lot of scrutiny of the actual science of EOR?
I think a bit of both. Um, yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, not a tough question anyway. My personal opinion, I mean, I sort of just care about what works, and I think like there's not a lot of support for kind of, incorporating EOR into like a negative emissions strategy, for the state. So I think it's like it's a loser, so and like, and whether I mean, EOR has been the kind of main thing we've done with CO2 to date, not just from the air, but from other point sources. And, but I think, it's fair. I mean, I don't know what your kind of average integrated assessment model would say, but I can't imagine we have much room or much scope for much EOR as part of our kind of basically like vertical need to drop like emissions over the next 2 decades. So I think in general, it's kind of yeah, it's it's not something I think there are better ideas out there, So, so anyway, it's kind of a wishy-washy answer, but yeah, maybe it's technically possible and you can run the accounting numbers and it kind of works out. But I think as a matter of practice, kind of incorporating EOR into a negative emissions strategy is not a good one for the political or the science. And so that's, I think, the reason, that guardrail's in this bill as well. So.
Okay. Okay, let's talk a little bit about this issue of public engagement, because it's as you mentioned, it's one of the pillars of the bill, and at the Institute, it's one of our really important issues, right? So I was looking at the language of the bill itself, and it says that an owner or an operator has to conduct, quote, meaningful community engagement. And it puts a little meat on that bones by saying that it has to include at least, quote, three community meetings, right? Um, the cynic in me wonders if that's actual robust public engagement, right? There's an acronym for what this public engagement looks like to me on the surface, right? We call it DEAD, right? Which is decide, educate the public, announce to the public what you're going to do, and then defend it, right? As opposed to public engagement that gives the public a meaningful chance of co-developing projects or ultimately saying we don't want the project, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like the bill contemplates real social license to operate, a veto on the part of the community, or real co-development. Is that your understanding of the bill, or is there more robust discussion going on behind the scenes?
No, I mean, I definitely think the intent is coming from a very good place. I don't. So okay, I will say that this kind of community section is not my like sort of, and the community kind of just kind of considerations, like kind of some of the the recent DOE efforts and the CBPs and like not kind of my area of like deep knowledge.
Mhm.
If I have deep knowledge anyway, I don't know. It's others can judge, but certainly the intent is like meant to be like, we really want to think about how to kind of get something in there that's, I mean, this would be requirements that I don't think any other projects have to kind of go through. So although on the one hand I think about, and you can tell me, but on the one hand I think about, and I don't think it's a bad thing, but if probably you're a good developer, you try and do good community engagement anyway, but at least this is trying to make it like a really explicit requirement, and then to try and draw in some of those DOE standards by using the language like community benefits plans and community benefits agreements. So I don't think, and certainly the industry and like the kind of developers that have been participant, like their intent is not to just like put, it's like a rubber stamp kind of, yeah, well, kind of, I think they're coming from a place that they know that the kind of credibility of their industry and ability to scale depends upon kind of doing a lot of these things the right way. So that's kind of really where the genesis of these kind of sections came from. There's, questions around like kind of, it's kind of gets a little complicated as well. It's like who should be which agency should be responsible for it. Like, it is also a new technology. Are we overburdening things? Are they going to do these things? So they're kind of, I think legitimate questions that get hashed out, but certainly, yeah. So my response would be certainly the intent of this section is like coming from a really good place, and it's certainly not just like the kind of the dead acronym that you express, So, but maybe there are ways that the section could be improved to provide people more comfort. But I'd also note that there's trade-offs. It's like and only really, I guess, kind of really maybe developers that have a better knowledge if this is really overburdening the project, or they plan to do these things anyway. And, I don't know. But anyway, that's my thoughts on that.
Okay. All right. Well, then I'll ask you another unfair question, right?
Yeah.
Associated with this, the provision that immediately follows thereafter talks about community benefit agreements, right?
Mm-hmm.
And community benefit agreements have become an extremely important aspect of CDR projects, including the direct air capture hubs, for example, that are being developed currently. And there's a lot of, as you know, a lot of controversy around community benefit agreements, right? And when I look at the provisions in the bill for this, it talks about, it's vague, right? It says there's got to be a plan for providing meaningful benefits to residents, such as an enforceable community benefit agreement, but it doesn't really provide much in terms of specific sort of provisions or contours or what the process is, right, for this. Do you know if there's active agency discussion about how to more granularly operationalize this in a way that ensures that these community benefit agreements are robust?
I don't know the answer to that, but I will say, like I only work in California, so I can't talk to other states, but we have very kind of significant environmental rules and regulations, the California Environmental Quality Act and others that, I don't think are explicit on community, but in general, like the kind of project development process is fairly rigorous. Can't talk for other states. I'm gathering that most of them are not at the California stringency on some of these kind of like sort of review and approval processes. I mean, that's kind of one of the knocks on us, which is a big economy, but geez, it takes a long time to build things there. So, so I don't, to the extent that is being, I think one of the challenges is like, could you really credibly flesh that out in a legislative proposal? Because, I imagine projects are so different, communities are different, costs are different in different regions to like deploy the technologies. I mean, probably that if you wanted to kind of really get the best way would be to, sort of it's got to sort of be in like a longer process than just like a bill, So, I imagine what you could achieve in a bill is to set something up like and maybe an agency to kind of really think about what the right process is. And but and I think it's probably one of the reasons on the community benefit reference as opposed to it's not an explicit requirement, but a kind of a such as something like that is because it's just too, this the kind of diversity of projects and communities and regions and what communities want is like it's you could be impossible to kind of prescribe that in a good, I think, in a bill. So so I think so perhaps there'll be more conversations on it to flesh it out more. I hope so. So yeah.
Yeah, I take your point that there can't be incredibly granular specification of these things, but probably I'd be more comfortable if there was a process that included a government agency and maybe reference to model community benefit agreement processes, because we do them in all kinds of activities, mining activities, development of energy production infrastructure and so forth, right? And I usually see more granularity than I see meaningful, right? So hopefully they will get to that, because I think it's not only right, but it's probably another a political third rail for this kind of legislation if they leave it there.
So
Okay.
can I just mention, sorry, just one more thing on that?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
the point is like yeah, just thinking about it more now. It's, California's very, like, like very diverse, like politically, like sort of place. And, there are one of the issues is there's probably some communities that like would rather do it themselves and like kind of be in charge of it. So whether they don't want like a state agency to kind of set the rules for them when they think that they can, you know, and then there are others that may be happy to be more deferential to an agency kind of setting. All that said, I'm sure you can like set it up in a way that would make more people come. But just things like these are the kinds of things that make it challenging to kind of do this in some of these elements in a bill. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let's say California passes this legislation, and I think we have to presume that ultimately it's a polluter pays model, unless they establish a utility model and decide that the public pays for this as a public good, right? Which would be a possibility too, and maybe a California sort of possibility. But let's presume they go the traditional CTBO route and the polluter pays. Is there a risk of substantial carbon leakage coming out of that? Could you see a lot of companies saying this is going to be an expensive mandate? It's only in California, so we're going to leave the state, and then as a consequence, you don't get any real benefits in terms of reducing CO2 emissions, or they move to states that are even laxer than California, which are many of them, right? And we get a net increase in CO2 emissions. What do you think about that argument?
Yeah. I think it's definitely something the state thinks about in general, right? We want an aggressive clean energy and climate program, but that wouldn't be credible if it just everyone, just like left to, build elsewhere. But I think it really would matter. It kind of matters on the mechanism, and it matters on, how quickly the technology cost can come down, So if we are able to leverage existing programs that have, this is just speculate, me thinking out loud, right? So like a low carbon fuel standard and cap and trade and others, I mean, payments are already being, like, they're already kind of covered entities. And if you basically what you're saying is you're taking portions of those pre-existing revenues that are generated from our climate programs and directing them to these projects, I mean, that all of a sudden starts to shave away at like the burden on the individual developer, that and like kind of how much they're, So yeah, I think it really depends on the program design. And I know that the Air Board would be, they're right on that. So I think, that's but yeah, I think the short answer is, I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So last question. Do you think that this kind of legislation would be sufficient to drive the kind of CDR scaling that we need in the state, or are there other things that you think need to complement it?
Definitely think there are other things. This is one kind of key. The issue is that, I mean, the core kind of part of this bill is about, it's like, we've got these really expensive but essential technologies. We need to help buy them down. So like interim targets, and like that's kind of this kind of early market development is kind of like the real, I would consider like the central theme and goal of the bill. But definitely just kind of buying down the cost of DAC alone for, and others is not enough, because I think a big other piece of the puzzle is the infrastructure. So if you are Climeworks or something and you're kind of getting your DAC cost down, I mean, you still need to offtake your CO2 like at scale. We need to have like it's like one of the challenges at the moment is like, that there is, you need to get your technology cost down, but also, it's a kind of a CDR project is really three projects. There's a capture project, there's a transport element, and then there is apart from these kind of initial ones, but in general, and then there's a storage, and like they're kind of often three different companies. It's like, the capture companies, the pipeline developer, and then like kind of, probably an oil company and other related that have geologic expertise that kind of do the storage type things, so, and they've kind of, all those projects need to link up. And so if you're, what's really appealing to you, if you're a DAC company, is that you want to offtake your CO2, like, you don't want to be responsible for figuring out the geology and, like being 100-year responsibility for the long-term storage and things like that. So basically, we needed policies to reduce this kind of type of bill, which would be a really significant, I think, global policy development in terms of setting this kind of interim target for kind of CDR. Is one piece of the puzzle, buying the cost down. The other key piece, I think, is infrastructure development and like figuring out how we kind of more rapidly build pipes and storage that can then kind of crowd in more CDR development, because they know they're going to be able to offtake their CO2 after they remove it from the atmosphere. So that's like a, we also talk with biomass developers, and they'll say, I'll be capture ready. Like, I'm going to do biomass to hydrogen. My plan is biomass to hydrogen. I'll be capture ready, but until I can figure out there's a kind of a credible and cost-effective way to offtake my CO2, it's like, you kind of let me know, like, when the kind of the pipes and the store, like large scale storage is going to come. So that's like another really important piece of the puzzle. And I think there's a lot of work the US can do nationally to think more creatively around how we can deploy infrastructure. So.
Yeah, has California been doing a lot in terms of things like pipelines and storage issues, right? Pennsylvania and Illinois, right, recently have passed new legislation. I used to live in California, and traditionally, right, there was a lot of resistance to these kind of things. Have things changed? Are there meaningful reforms that would help facilitate this integrated system that you're talking about?
Yeah. Well, SB 905, the bill I mentioned earlier, kind of provides certainly a good start. And then, we have a number of Class 6 permits at the US EPA. We don't have the kind of primacy authority but I would say no, there's still issues, So one is the pipelines. I mean, one thing that SB 905 did was put a moratorium on the ability to develop, or maybe, I think the expression is operate, so it really means that they develop CO2 pipes in California until the PHMSA rulemaking is made. And that's like honestly, that's a problem. It's like, I mean, it's the kind of thing that is I mean, if your objective is to scale CDR in the state, I mean, I think it's like it's definitely difficult, so it makes it difficult. So that's why, so the pipelines they've definitely sort of got to fix that, or hopefully PHMSA comes out soon, or, but, and then anyway, so there's definitely some barriers on the infrastructure front that we could think about. And then it's also, how do you incentivize more rapid deployment of infrastructure? I'll just highlight the UK have like a completely different model to kind of carbon deployment than the US, where they have like a significant level of state, or in their case, government involvement, where they have got kind of establishing transport and storage utilities, where they're trying to think about kind of low cost ways to deploy that infrastructure, reduce the risk of monopoly that can occur if you're like the only pipeline owner, So I think they offer. And they went through a really like a 5-year process to figure out what kind of models would best be suited for them. And I think that kind of discussions have not really happened in the US, in lieu of like a focus on 45Q and LCFS, and just kind of incentives versus like maybe we actually need like a full, like more of a regulatory model or like a public model to deploy, particularly to support the fair and kind of low cost deployment of infrastructure.
Okay. All right. Let's move to questions from the audience. I'd highlight at the outset that Chris Neidl, who's also working a lot on SB 308, has dropped a number of helpful links in the Q&A box for those that want additional information on SB 308 and might want to be involved in the bill. So first question here. Can carbon credits, I think they mean removal credits, be purchased from outside California under the bill?
No, nothing. like that in the bill. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Actually, no, just sorry. The word credit threw me. Is that
I,
can you
I
purchase?
I
Yeah.
think I think what they mean is if you were a company that had an
Mm.
obligation to remove a certain amount of carbon, could you purchase that carbon removal from a company or entity outside
Ah,
of the state of California? I think that's what they mean.
right. I have no
Does
idea.
it have
I'm just trying to think about how the accounting would work and like, that I don't know. So I don't think so is my kind of gut reaction, but I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that. Yeah. It's certainly not something prescribed in the bill, and maybe that would, if it was anything like that, possible it'd be like I guess directly engaging with a developer and probably depending on the air board's rules should the bill pass.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Next question from Rick Wayman. From what you know of CARB, does it have the technical expertise in-house to develop rigorous CDR regulations? And relatedly, as a government agency, can it move fast enough to meet the mandated timelines?
The first answer is definitely, I think so. And in fact, the air board is also in the midst of standing up a new kind of carbon management branch to kind of expand its engineering expertise and staff, like amount of staff on this issue. So they're really kind of smart and good agency, and I think they without doubt have the kind of technical and ability to kind of do this. And then can they go fast enough? I mean, one of the things is they it's just not just seeing this is kind of more of an energy transition issue, is like no agency is responsible for everything, right? So like the air board is not responsible for giving you like a pipeline permit or something, so like they can kind of come up with the strategy and the goals and the incentives, but like there's other elements when it comes to like a full kind of the project development process and this is for any kind of clean energy project, so I wouldn't, it's hard to hang it on any agency that like if everyone does their job, we might be okay. But the air board has its certain purview, which is kind of come up with the programs and the strategy and the plan. But like there's certain things it doesn't have control of, so it's hard to I'd say I can definitely feel very confident they do a really good job. But then it's like there's things outside their control as well, which is what I'm trying to say. So.
Okay. Next question. Did I hear Sam say that only municipal solid waste would be recognized as biomass under SB 308? What about forest residues?
No, definitely didn't hear me say that. So it's just the current provision is that only waste biomass. So it's the kind of division between waste and crop-based biomass. So only waste biomass is eligible. And I think certainly in California, most of us think of that as woody agricultural and forest residues, which are the kind of the main waste biomass residues we have. Probably most people in this call are familiar with this report. There's a Getting to Neutral Lawrence Livermore 2020 report, which provides a county by county level assessment of how much waste biomass there is, which has been like a good recurring resource for a lot of people. There is some municipal could be like organic waste from urban areas could be eligible also. There's no, it's just there has to be a waste stream. Yeah.
Do you know if there's been discussion about? I guess this would end up in the regulatory process as opposed to to what's specifically in the bill. But if there's been discussion about how to assess how much agricultural biomass in the form of residues can be removed from croplands before it starts to have negative impacts in terms of agricultural yield, for example, right? There's trade-offs here, and
Yeah.
one of the controversies is people assume sometimes 100% crop residues can be utilized, and that would turn out to be a bad idea.
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that on that. I mean, well, I believe fully in any of them. And I can just say that I think certainly if you're a residue, sorry, I don't know the answer, but like certainly if the Lawrence Livermore report is, I mean, if it's a residue, I think their assumption is like, I mean, in basically in the Central Valley, most of the residues are pile burned or just kind of left it. There's not, so that's like the worst thing. So I think doing anything else, and in this case, shooting for carbon removal would be an ideal thing. Certainly, like just as an example, the way the state thinks about it on forests, in the scoping plan, which is the state's net zero roadmap, the 2022 scoping plan, there's a section on forests, and they try and do an accounting of how much forest biomass would there be as part of how much BECCS we could get. And certainly I know that they use a model that was developed in Humboldt State that includes guardrails, like, you must kind of leave this percentage on the forest floor that science says is, necessary, for forest health, So, so certainly on the forest, they are factoring in those kinds of elements. And then, for ag, I'm not sure on agricultural residues as much. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Next question. Has there been any discussion around expanding the provisions to qualify other non-carbon forms of greenhouse gas removal in case any other GHG removal approach proves viable in the future? I think they're probably thinking of things like atmospheric methane removal, which Rob Jackson at Stanford, right, has been a big proponent of.
There hasn't been a discussion about it. That's interesting. I don't know anything really about that approach, but that I'll just say that the inventory is like a CO2e kind of, everything is converted. So, it seems like plausible that if you could, I'm not sure, but yeah, that's the certainly it's focused on carbon dioxide to kind of counterbalance what was the CO2e number in 2045, So yeah.
Okay.
Well,
All right.
I'll sorry, just mention that the state also has like methane reduction strategies as a separate, series of policies. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Does 308 say anything about projects or benefits being in state? I think this is I think the same question as before. Do the projects have to be state-based? I think we've already covered that, right?
Well, yeah, or he or she could. There wasn't a previous. I don't think it's in the current version. If I'm mistaken, if I'm wrong, but there was a version that was there was a provision that was requiring some percentage of projects must be. So for getting the kind of credit, sort of like potential for purchasing, and it was some percentage of projects must be in state versus out of state, and that has been removed. But I think my understanding is that the state can only count these removal projects towards its targets if they're in state. So that people may be aware that an incentive program like the low carbon fuel standard can incentivize direct air capture projects out of state.
Right.
Kind of like California trying to do a good thing.
Yeah.
I don't believe that those projects would count, say you did it in like Texas or something, that they would count towards, that'd be kind of California supporting that project, but I don't believe they'd be able to count it towards this CDR target because it wouldn't be in the state's borders.
Yeah. Do you personally think that's a good idea? If that's how they construe it, I can't figure out why that would be a good thing, right? Because why would we care if if a entity in California wanted to fund an enhanced rock weathering project somewhere else in the country that facilitates carbon removal, why do we care that it's not being done in Fresno?
What? So it's this is probably like a political one, which is like it's like so scientifically yes, like CDR from anywhere, kind of thing, but then it's also like California dollars like supporting CDR in other states and kind of not getting the benefit of like workforce development and other job creation and revenue creation in the state, so maybe there's some portion because we want to the state is, particularly the air board, always kind of wanting to push the envelope and do the right thing, so maybe there's some early portion where it's like in the early, I mean, that's kind of why they put DAC in the LCFS and you could get it globally because then, then it's a question of, I mean, my counterpoint would be, why don't other states pass 308, their own 308, and then everyone can do it, so that would be, I think we sort of see this more as like a hope is that the bill can kind of, be a kind of a pioneering policy that other states and the nation can consider. And then, you know, maybe there's some role for California in the early days to support out-of-state projects, you know. But then I think over time it just gets harder to, as the numbers go up, it probably gets harder to say, yeah, we sent like $1 billion out of state to support that, you know what I mean? Like just makes it more, that's where maybe the science and policy collide, you know. So yeah.
Okay. All right. A question. My apology. One of the members of the audience didn't think we clarified the EOR issues enough, right? So, could you briefly explain again what enhanced oil recovery is and what's the controversy around utilizing CO2 for enhanced oil recovery purposes? CO2 that's captured.
So enhanced oil recovery is not just something unique to CDR. It's this idea of you're taking CO2 from a point source, or it could be future CDR, and then sort of storing it geologically. But instead of just storing it like in a, you know, underground, you're also, you know, you're helping increase oil production. It's kind of part of an oil production process. So the idea is that yes, you're putting the CO2 underground, but you're also increasing oil kind of production, which is that creates emissions. So there'd be like this life cycle assessment where it's like not as good if you just put the CO2 underground and didn't use it to produce oil at the same time. So so the bill excludes the ability to use any CO2 that could be captured for CDR purposes to also do for the purpose of enhanced oil recovery. In other words, you have to just capture the CO2 and put it underground and leave it there and not produce any oil at the same time. And so the idea is that, you know, oil is underground. So, and basically you sort of put it in a different geologic area than like where you would also produce oil at the same time. So,
yeah. And as we said in the discussion, the controversy to some degree is those that are proponents of EOR argue that if you didn't, even though obviously enhanced oil recovery results in more oil production, right? And once that oil's used, it produces CO2. The argument is that if you didn't have the EOR operation, you wouldn't capture any CO2, and you get the oil from somewhere else, might even be a nastier source, and you'd have, on balance, more CO2 in the atmosphere, right? But as you pointed out, that's all contingent on the life cycle assessment and the parameters of that life cycle assessment, and it's hotly contested, right?
Yeah.
And it seems like California, at least this bill, opts to not address that issue by eliminating it as a possibility. So, okay. Statement by Chris that it's legislation, it's not program rules, and it shouldn't be interpreted as strategic vagueness. I don't know, Chris. I disagree with you a bit. I've seen enough legislation myself, especially on controversial issues like this, where there's more specificity and guidance provided than I saw in this bill. And I think there may be a difference between generalized bill provisions and maybe efforts at real strategic vagueness that I thought probably went a little too far for my taste, but that's my opinion. Okay, moving on. Next question. Regarding community engagement and benefits, perhaps state laws should defer to DOE guidance, which admittedly are still emerging. And then there's a link in here to a discussion of what, you know, DOE's work right now on developing the contours of community engagement as well as community benefit agreements.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is that's certainly where the inspiration for those kind of provisions on community engagement came from. So maybe it would be a good kind of reference to make. I second it. I don't know. As I said, not an area that I have worked as much on, and sort of I know that I sort of hesitant to answer because I know people are much more knowledgeable on it, and I don't want to just kind of shoot from the hip on it, and you know, an area I don't know as well. So yeah.
But I agree. I think it's going to be an extremely important aspect of this, and that's why I'm a little worried, even though yes, it is just bill legislation, that there wasn't a little more guidance and specificity. But it seems like
Yeah.
there's certainly some models out there, and it'll be
I,
interesting to see what they do with it.
I just would read. I mean, part of this is also it's hard to. It's like it's yeah it's like one thing to look at a bill, and then it's like to actually be like in California and kind of understanding the dynamics of the state and like kind of other things, like the context of other kind of clean energy issues that are going on. And in general, there's certainly a strong feeling that like we as a state are like running into a number of bottlenecks that are affecting our ability to deploy clean energy. And it's like I'm not saying this is just a broader statement from my work on other issues as well. So it's not about this provision, and I'm not that associated with these provisions. So it's like are we just adding more stuff? Like it's kind of, we already have like really kind of high quality rules in terms of project development, and like lengthy and rigorous review processes seems to be more than any other state. So I guess the question would be, can we add this, and do we not already do it, or and if we don't do it well enough, we can add this, and is it just going to be an additional like requirement, or is it are there other ways we could streamline other areas to kind of not just continue to add to because we're in like a lack of build crisis, and I think everyone so just provide that as a comment around this, not just so
Yeah,
yeah.
it's an interesting question, right? And obviously the the bipartisan bill right now to try to speed up energy production at the federal level, right, reflects this, right? Uh, on the other hand, you have environmental justice groups that say there's a history of these projects always ending up in our areas and disproportionately impacting our areas, and this may be another instance of it, right? And it's a novel technology, right, which I think creates more trepidation, right, than maybe the nth wind
Yeah,
turbine, right?
yeah,
It's an interesting question. Okay, we have room for time, I think, for one more question in here. You talked about buying DAC costs down. What do you think are realistic targets that could be achieved within the next 10 years? And what quantity of total carbon removal do you think society needs? That's a nice broad question for
yeah.
you.
Don't have that. I'm really equipped to answer that. Honestly, I actually think, yeah, I have no idea. Like, it really depends on the technology. Like, I think the goal is to try and get it down to the $150 per ton level for DAC, but that is like, I think, some ways away. I personally think if we're going to achieve our CDR targets, we should be kind of targeting a bit of a non-linear trajectory, which is like, or that's what we should be expecting. Like, we shouldn't be kind of expecting major DAC progress by 2030. We should have some progress, but then it really kind of ramps like as we kind of get towards mid-century. And part of the driver for that is like when infrastructure starts becoming available to make investment decisions for DAC companies more easy, So yeah, I don't know. Sorry, I don't know what the costs could look like. So yeah.
Now that's a hard one.
Yeah.
And I do like the fact that this bill, um, whether one totally agrees with it or not, tries to carve out a CDR budget for California, right?
Yeah.
Based on some criteria, right, that reflect notions, I think, of fairness, and also track, the obligations under AB 32. So that'll be interesting to watch. Do you have any final thoughts or comments as we take this out, Sam?
Uh, no, I mean, I mean, we think this is a really significant policy, just by virtue. I mean, I think it would be a world-leading kind of first, like, interim and long-term kind of targets and framework for achieving CDR in the context of, the kind of, as we talked about, this mandate, which requires 85% reduction. So I feel like California, is really trying to do it the right way. So, it's the focus is really market development, like in these early stage, like, technologies and trying to kind of get the cost down. So that's a key theme. So I think we're hopeful that this bill can progress. There's a month to go also in the legislative session, and then there's a kind of bill signing, and so we shall see.
All right, we'll keep watching. So,
Yeah.
okay, we have hit the top of the clock. I'm really glad you came on, Sam, to talk about this bill, and thanks for all the thoughtful questions from the audience. We're planning to continue to try to discuss this question of the role of compliance markets, right, in as a form of responsible carbon removal, and so this will be one of many in this series during the year. And so I hope you'll all join us in the future also. And with that, I will say have a great rest of your day, everyone. Goodbye now.
Thank you.